Hey everybody. So we've been talking about how different taxa acquire and process nutrients. And we began talking about the photoautotrophs, or the land plants. We're going to get into examples of chemoheterotrophs and how they acquire and process nutrients. So when we talk about chemoheterotrophs, examples of that would be fungi and animals. But right now what we're talking about are the land plants, which are an example of photoautotrophs and how they acquire and process nutrients. And just to recap where we've been over the last few lectures, we've talked about the nutrients that all organisms need. We've talked about some of the generalities of nutrient acquisition and the different types of trophy that exist. We've talked about some of the themes for acquiring and transporting nutrients, like trade-offs and surface area to volume ratios. And we began talking about how plants acquire and transport nutrients, plants being our sort of representative of the photoautotrophs. And so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to continue on this sort of next theme of how plants acquire and transport nutrients. And we're going to talk about carbon. So if you've not yet viewed these previous lectures, please do so before you move on in this lecture. So remember that plants are examples of photoautotrophs. So all organisms can be broken down into their different sorts of trophies for how they acquire energy and the carbon source that they use. And so plants are photoautotrophs. They acquire their energy from sunlight, and their carbon source, so remember we're carbon-based organisms, they get their carbon from inorganic sources. So inorganic sources mean non-living sources. So for example, plants get their carbon from carbon dioxide in the air, or CO2. And so plants are phototrophs, they're autotrophs, and so in general, they need to get CO2 and light and other essential minerals to survive. So how do plants go about acquiring that CO2 and light? We talked about, or we've been talking about, the shoot system. So this is the above ground system of sort of branches and leaves that are used to collect CO2 and light. And so I want to pick up where we left off with this. So in this picture, what you're seeing right here is a baby giant sequoia tree. And you can actually order these off the internet for about 15 bucks. And they'll send it to you. And if you plant it in your backyard and you got the right conditions, and you can wait a couple hundred or 1,000 years, this baby sequoia that you plant in your backyard could grow into something as big as this. So this is General Sherman. It's a giant sequoia tree. It's 275 feet tall and it weighs over 4 million pounds. And it's believed to be the largest living single-stem tree on Earth by volume. So you can see the tree from the base, and you can see sort of a person at the bottom here to give you an idea of how big this tree is. So my question to you is, if you were, God forbid, to cut this tree down and dry it out, where did the vast majority of its remaining dry mass come from? So in other words, how did it grow from this little seedling up to this giant, giant tree? Where did all that weight and dry mass come from? Did it come from water, sunlight, minerals in the soil, CO2 in the air, or maybe something else? Go ahead and write in your answer. Okay, so I'm not going to give you the answer to this question yet. What we're going to do first is watch this video.
Cambridge, Massachusetts. Graduation day at Harvard and MIT.
Here's a seed.
Okay.
Okay? Now hold on to that for a second.
Okay.
Imagine that I planted that in the ground.
Okay.
And a tree grew. All right? And here is a piece of that tree.
Sure.
Okay? Now, where did all that stuff come from?
So where do plants come from? You look at these beautiful big redwood trees, these great spreading valley oaks, and you know they start from this little tiny seed. It's miraculous. Where does all that weight come from?
The mass came from a lot of things, I'd guess. I'd guess from water that it sucked up from the ground. I would guess from minerals that it sucked up from the ground.
Water, light, soil.
Well, I mean, I suppose in terms of raw mass, most of it's probably derived from actual like matter in the soil itself, and some of it comes from water, obviously, but a large amount of it comes from the nutrients that the roots absorb from the soil.
Now, what would you say to someone who said to you that most of the weight of the tree came from the carbon dioxide in the air?
I would say I would have no idea. I'd have to think about that.
I would disagree because this same volume of air wouldn't weigh this much unless it was highly compressed.
I said that's very disturbing, and wonder how that could happen.
It's a very strange idea that somehow the air, which they view as nothing, as weightless, as insubstantial, somehow makes a tree, a giant tree that weighs several tons. I mean, it's absolutely incredible.
That'd be hard to believe because carbon dioxide is, well, it's a gas, and it doesn't seem intuitive that you could add mass taking in a gas.
But that's where it comes from. Takes those carbon molecules and packs them together via chemical reactions so tight that you get this huge mass. So what does it mean that these Harvard graduates don't understand the fundamental idea of photosynthesis? Well, it's symbolic of the state of the nation. These are the best that we produce. They don't understand it. After all these years of school, who does?
So by the end of this, hopefully you guys are going to be as smart or smarter than MIT grads. So let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. So what happens to the CO2 and light in plants? So let's think about CO2 and let's follow a single sort of carbon atom. Let's see what happens to that carbon atom that builds this CO2 molecule. So these C atoms, in photosynthesis, we take CO2 and H2O and we incorporate the C atoms in that CO2 into the C atoms in glucose or sugar. So those C atoms are turned into or reduced to this more high energy molecule of sugar. And in addition, CO2 to CO2 light is used in photosynthesis. So basically, C atoms are made to connect to make sugars, and the energy in these bonds of these sugars, so you have these carbon atoms bonded together with lots of H's and OH groups and all that stuff, the energy from light is converted into chemical energy in the bonds of those sugars. And so you take CO2 and turn it into this glucose molecule, the carbon atoms in this glucose molecule, and you take the energy in light and turn it into the bonds that are forming between all of these different atoms making up that glucose molecule, okay? And so this is the process of photosynthesis, where CO2 is used to make carbon-to-carbon bonds or molecules. So you're taking an inorganic molecule and turning it into, in this case, this organic molecule. So you're converting inorganic carbon in CO2 into organic carbon in glucose. And light is used to supply the energy to create these bonds. And so you're converting light and energy into chemical energy in the bonds of this molecule. And that chemical energy is a better biological currency. And so you're turning electromagnetic radiation, electromagnetic energy into chemical energy that's more sort of biologically useful and biologically reactive. So that's photosynthesis. So this is one thing that happens to the CO2 and light in the plants. Okay, so let's figure out what happens next with that glucose. So why go through all this trouble to have photosynthesis and make glucose? So glucose can be used to make ATP via cellular respiration. So remember, the process of cellular respiration is basically sort of the reverse of photosynthesis, where you're taking glucose and oxygen, and you're taking the carbon in that glucose and you're turning it into carbon and CO2. So you're basically taking this reduced molecule, this higher energy reduced molecule, and turning it into this more lower energy oxidized molecule of CO2. And in that process, you're releasing the energy that's caught in those chemical bonds, and you're using that energy to produce ATP. And remember, ATP is that cellular currency. It's a sort of very biologically useful molecule to power a bunch of other reactions at the cellular level, okay? And so you're untrapping or untapping, you're tapping into the chemical energy that's in this glucose molecule. And in the process, you're turning carbon in the glucose into carbon in CO2, which ultimately that CO2 is going to go back out into the atmosphere. So it'll leave the plant and go back out into the atmosphere. And so this process, remember, this is cellular respiration. I'm going to refer to that sometimes as just CR. I may refer to photosynthesis sometimes as just PS. And so cellular respiration, just to reiterate, is the carbon in glucose is converted to CO2. So you're turning this carbon into this carbon. You're doing this multiple times over and over within the mitochondria of the plant cells. So remember that plant cells, they have chloroplasts that you see right here. These plant cells, they also have mitochondria, right? And so those mitochondria will take the sugars that are produced by photosynthesis in these chloroplasts, and they'll convert that sugar into CO2 to produce ATP for those plant cells, okay? And so the energy in the carbon bonds is used to make ATP, and that ATP in turn can be used for other important chemical reactions. And one of those important chemical reactions, among many that ATP is used for, is for this third process that I want to talk about, which is connecting carbon to carbon atoms to make other important carbon-based molecules that make up plants. So we can have things like cellulose. So this is a polysaccharide that's carbon-based. You can have things like nucleotides, so like DNA and RNA that are made up of nucleic acids that also are carbon-based molecules. You can have other macromolecules like starch. So this is another polysaccharide that's very important in plants. And so the point here is all of these macromolecules are carbon-based. Those carbon atoms that they're made of have to come from somewhere. And as it turns out, those carbon atoms ultimately come from CO2. So that CO2 gets converted into these sugars. And those sugars, in fact, those carbon molecules and sugars can also go to make these various macromolecules. So, for example, this is called a process that, for this course, we'll call it biosynthesis. So we're just building biomass, okay? And so you may see this, I'll refer to this sometimes as just BS. So biosynthesis is basically taking carbon atoms from CO2, and they're converted into glucose in photosynthesis, but then ultimately those carbon atoms and those glucose molecules are converted into other biomolecules. So this is a different use for the carbon molecules in these reduced glucose and other sugar molecules that are produced by photosynthesis, okay? And some of the energy from these ATP that's produced here can also be used to construct these higher energy carbon-to-carbon molecules. And so basically, what I'm trying to say is that trees can turn the C in CO2, so the CO2 that's in the air, into carbon molecules that make up their biomass. And that is if they're not already using that carbon for cellular respiration, releasing that CO2 back to the atmosphere. So for example, if you look at these potatoes are built up of starch. Those starch are polysaccharides, carbon-based molecules. Same thing with all the leaves at the top of the potato plant. All of the starch and cellulose in these potatoes and the leaves are built from carbon that was once CO2 air molecules in the air, tightly packed together through this process of photosynthesis. Okay, so going back to this question of growing a tiny little plant up to giant General Sherman, okay? So where does this dry biomass, where does all the vast majority of this biomass come from in General Sherman if you were to dry this tree completely out? So you should say D, CO2 in the air, and you are now smarter than an MIT graduate. Congratulations. So let's try another question. Which of the following is false regarding the use of CO2 in plants? If you said D, this is the false statement. That is correct. So most of a plant's dry weight, aka if you take all the water out, comes from minerals that are obtained from the soil by the root system. So that is false. A very, very, very tiny percentage of a plant's dry mass does actually come from the minerals that are obtained by the soil by the root system. We'll talk about that in some future lectures, but it's such a tiny proportion that like 99.99% of the biomass of a plant's dry weight actually comes from the incorporation of carbon atoms from CO2 in the plant's biomass, okay? So it comes from the air, not from the soil. Another point that I want to drive home from these choices, so all the rest of these choices are true, but another point that I want to drive home is that some of the carbon atoms in the sugars produced by photosynthesis end up being converted back to CO2. Okay, so carbon atoms that are taken from the atmosphere and turned into sugars, they go through cellular respiration and ultimately get turned back to CO2 and can ultimately end up back in the atmosphere. And so this lends to this idea of the conservation of matter. So organisms can't produce carbon out of nowhere. They have to get those carbon atoms to make different macromolecules, and the carbon that makes us up has to come from somewhere. And in turn, that carbon actually never gets destroyed. A lot of it ends up being released back into the atmosphere. And so this idea that matter cycles, so you have a carbon molecules and carbon atoms cycling through the atmosphere and through organisms is an important concept to take home. That you can't create carbon atoms out of anywhere, you can't destroy them. Instead, those atoms cycle through the system. Okay, so just to recap, we've been through all of this, and now we've added in these two major points. Plants use carbon in CO2 for biosynthesis, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration. And that carbon cycles around through these different processes and through the air. And the vast majority of a plant's biomass, dry biomass, comes from CO2. And so what we'll talk about next is continuing to talk about how plants acquire and transport and use nutrients, and talk a little bit about the root system that's below ground for acquiring minerals.